Was Noah's Ark sunk by a nuke? Watch on, and then you decide. First, I need to connect some dots. Now, it might surprise you to know that when I was born, there was no general understanding of plate tectonics or continental drift. And so the world was still open for lost world myths of Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, and biblical floods. But in the few decades that have passed since my miraculous conception, scientific knowledge has shone a light to dispel the shadow of ignorance from one more jigsaw piece of the puzzle of life. And anyone who does not now accept plate tectonics to be part of the natural world is either uneducated or in willful denial. But back to the shadows of ignorance for a moment, and where better to lurk than in yet another illustration of the deep dishonesty of Ian Juby.
How did Noah get animals from the different continents if he was building the ark in, say, the Middle East? Well, actually, there wasn't any different continents during Noah's time. We would contend that continental division occurred at the time of Noah's flood. In fact, this whole concept of continental division actually came from the Bible. Pellegrini was reading Genesis, where it said God separated the waters into one place and the land appeared. He deduced from this passage that it must also mean the land was in one place. He then started experimenting with how the continents could perhaps fit together. Later on, his continental division theory was hijacked by those who believe in deep time, labeled it plate tectonics, and claimed it took millions of years. You can see how a biblical idea is twisted around to allegedly refute the Bible.
So, in this episode of Looney Tunes, Juby promotes and applauds Pellegrini for his biblical explanation of the separation of the continents to their current positions. He is, of course, quote mining, and therefore picks out the one thing which Pellegrini says which supports the Juby delusion, whilst ignoring everything else Pellegrini states. This is normal fare for Juby, who lies to his audience knowing that they are after positive reinforcement for their beliefs, rather than caring about checking the facts. But I do care about the facts, so let me provide you with some. Pellegrini's work is his attempt to resolve the origin of American Aborigines within the context of biblical history, because he could not see how these people travelled to and populated North and South America after the flood, when Europeans had not managed to reach the continent until the end of the 15th century. So Pellegrini tried to reconcile the Bible stories with the knowledge of his time, and he used the work of Newton, Herschel, Humboldt and others to inform his ideas. Pellegrini deduced that the opening of the chasm, which now forms the Atlantic Ocean, prevented the flood of Noah from ever reaching the Americas. So, no global flood there, Ian. You forgot to mention that. And from this, Pellegrini also deduced that all of the Native Americans were directly descended from Adam rather than Noah, i.e. they were flood survivors, which utterly destroys Juby's biblical judgment narrative. Pellegrini also knew that the earth could not be 6,000 years old, so to try to reconcile science with religion, he deduced that each creation day was actually equal to an astrological grand year based on the precession of the equinoxes, which he knew or understood to be 36,000 years. We now know it to be a little under 26,000 years. That would be deep time then, Ian, which you also forgot to mention. Pellegrini also discussed at some length how the people living in the sun got their heat and light, which is no discredit to him. He was in good company believing this nonsense at the time. But knowledge grows and nonsense fades. Anyway, enough of Dewey quote mining and misrepresenting the facts to rationalise his delusions. We have the advantage of 150 years of scientific exploration over Pellegrini, thousands of years advantage over the flat earth spear throwers who wrote the Bible myths, and the advantage of an inquiring mind over anyone who takes what Dewey says at face value. So what has science taught us? Or should I say, how do we know what we know? Pellegrini was not, as Dewey states, the first to notice that Africa and South America look uncannily like they were once joined together. Ortelius discussed it in 1596, Lilienthal in 1756, and Humboldt in the early 1800s in his Cosmos, which was translated into English in 1845. Humboldt is a monster of exploring and well worth looking up. Anyway, whilst all these people with the benefit of maps could see that Africa and South America looked like they belonged together, they had no mechanism to explain why they were now separated by ocean. Now Arthur Holmes did suggest that convection within the Earth moved the crust in his Principles of Physical Geology, 1944, though his ideas were much older. But to understand how recent acceptance of the ideas of plate tectonics or continental drift are, I can do no better than call on someone you should all know. David Attenborough recalls that whilst he was in university in the 1940s, I once asked one of my lecturers why he was not talking to us about continental drift, and I was told, sneeringly, that if I could prove there was a force that could move continents, then he might think about it. The idea was moonshine, I was informed. Stepping back in time a little bit, it was Alfred Wegener who coined the term continental drift when he presented the, up to then, most complete theory of the breakup of the continents. But Wegener had no mechanism to explain how the continents moved. It took several discoveries to explain what we now understand. The first was pure observation by physical sounding. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge was the first to be discovered. It was detailed during the Challenger expedition of 1872 to 1876. Now in 1947, the Woods Hole Institute ship, for which the Atlantis space shuttle was named, sailed the Atlantic Ocean using sonar and taking samples, and discovered some intriguing things. The floor of the seabed was basalt rather than the granite which forms most continents, and the ocean crust was much thinner than continental crust, which needed explaining. Further surveys were carried out across the world in the 40s and 50s, and it was discovered that there was a global system of ridges. But when I was born, there was still no widely accepted mechanism for seafloor spreading, mainly because if the seafloors were spreading, there was no accepted way that continents could dive through the seafloor to get rid of the excess land at the other side. It was at the height of the Cold War in 1963 that a treaty was put in place to ban above-ground testing of nuclear weapons. A worldwide network of seismographs had been put in place to help monitor this ban, and it was this network which for the first time allowed very accurate mapping of earthquakes. It was quickly seen that earthquakes were concentrated in certain areas of the globe, and mapping these provided the outlines of the tectonic plates. But the seismographs showed something else. Analysis of the propagation of seismic waves showed that large slabs of the continental crust were indeed plunged deep into the mantle. This helped confirm the idea of subduction, and subduction, combined with seafloor spreading, explained continental drift. The theory was quickly accepted, and this revolutionized geological thinking. Also, in 1963, the Morley-Vine-Matthews hypothesis, as it is now known, predicted that the Earth's magnetic pole reversals would be visible in the spreading seafloor. The hot magma spewing from the ridges would take on the polarity of the Earth, and this polarity would be frozen when the rock cooled. There would thus be stripes on either side of the oceanic ridges of alternating polarity. These would match known magnetic reversals which had been dated in rocks using radiometric techniques pioneered by Holmes all those years ago, and there would be global consistency in the measurements. The hypothesis was sound and the predictions confirmed by observation. Since the 1960s, the science of plate tectonics has continued to improve. Mountains of seismic data has been collected and analysed. More accurate magnetic anomaly measurements have taken place, and space exploration has allowed GPS measurements of the moving tectonic plates. These elements combine to tell us which plates are moving, in which directions, and at what speed. And it is through this that we know the processes of continental drift have been in place for hundreds of millions of years.